Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
We're picking up in the story of David, 2 Samuel chapter 19, and what we see is after the death of Absalom, David's heart is stricken with grief, and we read verses 1 through 3, and Joab was told, "The king is weeping and mourning for Absalom." And for the whole army, the victory that day was turned into mourning, because on that day the troops heard it, said, "The king is grieving for his son." The men stole into the city that day as men steal in who were ashamed when they flee from battle. Look, there are times as leaders that things break our heart, cut us to the heart. We're worried, we're stressed, we have anxiety, we're disappointed. But how we manage that in public and what we let people see is very, very crucial to our influence as leaders. So our outlook has a dramatic impact on how others look at us. So Joab comes to David and he goes, "Look, man, you need to snap out of this. Look, I understand you're grieving, but the way you're carrying yourself, it's impacting the morale of the whole army. In fact, if you don't quit, I'm going to leave and the army's going to go with me. Shake up, man, and snap out of it." And there are times that you're leading and bleeding at the same time. David was bleeding emotionally, but he still needed to be a leader. And there are the right places to bleed, and there's the wrong places to bleed. And so how do you manage yourself when you're going through crisis, when you're going through a difficult time, when you're going through a challenge? Are you bleeding all over the team? Are you crying on everybody's shoulder? "Well, I thought we were supposed to be transparent." I thought, well, yeah and no, there's a fine line for that. And so let's just kind of unpack, how do we manage the emotional side, the pain side of leadership, while still sending a message of follow me as I follow Christ? So how do we go about doing that? Aaron, who was really the first priest established by Moses through the instruction of the Lord, he had two sons who offered what God called strange fire before him. And fire literally came from heaven and consumed them. So they offered strange fire. Now, God used a very dramatic message to send a message to all times that when we offer strange fire for God, things die, we get burned up, and they literally got fired. So a lot of times people get fired because they're just doing a bunch of strange things that God never said to do, that are outside of the boundaries in which God established. And God told Aaron something very interesting. He said, "Don't cry for them. Don't grieve for them." Now, part of it was he knew that if he's mourning and he's grieving, then it would send to Israel this message, "Feel sorry for me." And God never wants to be to draw sympathy at God's expense. So if I'm starting to feel sorry for myself, look at me, whoa, this is hard, I'm getting sympathy from people, but I'm doing it at God's expense. Look, Aaron's sons made the mistakes. It was Aaron's son's fault. Now, it's not that he didn't care as a father. It's not that he couldn't in his own heart have his emotional feelings, but he was a leader, and a leader is held to a higher accountability. There's a higher degree of sacrifice. And so what he needed to send to the people was, I'm behind God on this, and my kids disobeyed God, and they suffered the consequences for their own decisions. And as a leader, I'm here representing God, and I'm on God's side in this situation. And so there's just times that how you portray yourself when you're going through a crisis is really what determines how people respond to you and how they respond in the midst of that company and that crisis. When you look at the Apostle Paul, if anybody had a right to feel sorry for themselves in the Bible, it was the Apostle Paul. He was shipwrecked. He was, beaten with rods. He was stoned to death with rocks and left for dead. And he goes on and on and on. I've had like a paper cut. I've had a couple negative emails. I've had nothing compared to the Apostle Paul. My air conditioner went out one time. Whoa, I feel sorry for myself. Like, Paul had legitimate challenges and sufferings. And you know what? He never one time felt sorry for himself. In fact, he's in a Roman jail cell, writes the book of joy called the book of Philippians, and he's writing from a Roman jail cell strapped chained literally to a Roman soldier 24 hours a day. And he shares with us the secret to having joy in the midst of problems, in the midst of crisis. In the very first chapter alone, he mentions the name Christ 18 times. And he uses the word Christ 50 times in the next 4 chapters. Why? He could maintain joy because his mind was continually on Jesus. The key to joy in the midst of whatever challenges we face is just to keep our eyes, keep our mind on Jesus. Jesus, the example of leadership, he went through stressful times. Matthew 26, verse 36, then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, sit here while I go over there and pray. Then he took Peter, took 2 sons of Zebedee, that's James and John, along with them, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And then he said to them, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here, keep watch with me. Going a little further, he fell on his face to the ground and prayed, my Father, if at all possible, let this cup be taken from me, yet not my will, but your will be done. Now, he didn't share the full depth of his pains and his emotions with the 12. He shared it with the 3. And so Jesus is showing us, you can't just show everybody the same level of pain, the same level of fear and emotion with everybody. Jesus didn't do that. Now, didn't mean he wasn't authentic. He was authentic. He was just authentic at the right place at the right time with the right people. Not everybody can handle what you feel. And so publicly, as a leader, your job's to bring faith in the midst of a bunch of fear. Your job is to fill the vacuum with courage. Your job is to bring vision where there's no vision. And inside you, you may have all kinds of pain. You may have all kinds of turmoil going on, but that's between you and Jesus, and you process that in the right place. Hey, a counselor, that's a great place. The thing I love about a great counselor is, number one, legally, they can't tell other people. So you can go in there and pour your heart out and say everything you want to say, and they can't tell anybody. You need a safe place to be able to process and be completely vulnerable. Then you need some really close prayer partners that you have one another's back. They're trustworthy. You can share what you're going through. That's what Jesus had with Peter, James, and John, and that's who he was most vulnerable with. To the public, I love the statement, never let them see you sweat. You never saw Jesus sweat. I take it a step further. I go, more importantly, never let them smell you sweat. Because if they smell you sweat, that's just bad. All right? So here we go. There's a time in ministry. There's a time in leadership. There's times as a CEO, as a boss, as a manager, you're going to be leading while you're bleeding. It's just knowing the right appropriate places to be able to share those vulnerable moments. But as a leader, you're bringing faith, you're bringing courage, because that's what the crowd follows, and that's what the crowd takes their cues from. If you're panicked, they're really panicked. If you're afraid, they're really afraid. So your job's to bring peace in the midst of the storm.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at eriklawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.